Thank you very much. How is everyone doing? Please drop in a hello in the chat. Tell me where you're tuning in from, what part of the world, and I'm really happy to be sitting here talking to you from Manchester in the UK, where it is slightly sunny, but not so much so that you'd want to go to the beach, which is good because that's not a choice anyway. So great. I'm seeing things like Belfast, Sierra Leone, Romania, Colombia. Amazing. This is great to see. So as Lionel said, I'm going to speak to you for 30 minutes. But in that chat, I'm gonna be asking you questions, and if you have any thoughts or examples, just feel free to pop them into the chat, and I will pick them up as I go along. So let me share my screen with you. I'm gonna share the link to the presentation here, just in case you have two devices in front of you and you'd want to pull up the screen and see that there too. So I've put in the bit.ly link for the presentation that I'm gonna do, and let me share my screen. So, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about investigating public spending. So, public procurement, government contracts, it is, as Lionel said, this is unfortunately a time where governments are facing a really horrendous crisis. And to tackle this, to fight this coronavirus, they are spending lots of money in a very short amount of time to on a variety of things, and you all know this as reporters. So I will talk you through some red flags and how you can see if there are corruption risks in a deal. How do you investigate that, and tell you a little bit more about what I do. So, and I've got my details here, so you can contact me on my email address or on Twitter, and there's the Open Contracting's Twitter as well. So, government contracts, why are they important? It's big money. It's $9.5 trillion every year. We're actually doing some research to figure out whether that figure is accurate or it's even more than that, which we'll be releasing later this year. And you'll be able to see that. But that's just a lot of money. So that's $1 bill stacked to the moon and back. That is how much money we're talking about. It is also a government's number one corruption risk. It pops up in a lot of cases of foreign bribery. So we know that it's important. And in the current climate, it's really important because, we have all the classic signs or situations which can exacerbate this risk. So whether that is, short amount of period of time, external stress factors like you need to get this through to save lives, and huge demand for certain products, which means that they go out of supply. So all these things mean that it is the creating the environment in where a lot of opaque deals can happen. So there's some really interesting stories that are coming out. There's a great piece from OCRP that came out this week around Slovenia. Then there was a case that was discussed quite a lot 2 weeks ago in Spain, and you'll see here that it was they had procured tests which were not as accurate as they thought, which really set them back. There was a lot of stuff happening in the UK as well, where I'm based, around ventilators. And here is a piece from the US, so the New York Times, talking about the same thing, how the White House is going through a deal with ventilators, and there's a lot of criticism around that. Ventilators are actually quite a interesting item for investigations because of how much work is being done, both to supply it, but also in finding new suppliers, so that are not your typical suppliers. So why am I talking to you about this? Who am I? I work at Open Contracting Partnership, which is a nonprofit. It's based, the headquarters are based in DC, but we work remotely. So I have 17 colleagues from different parts of the world, and Open Contracting is all about opening up and monitoring public contracts. So that means connecting government, business, and civil society together, and to really, create an environment where government is doing business in the open, and that this is something that leads to, we've seen in our work, has led to, better value for money, better public services, less corruption, and more innovation. So we do advocacy. We also support a group of partners. So and I'll tell you a bit more about where we work. We have a data standard, again, that'll come up. And lastly, we share what's working. So everything that I'm going to talk to you about today comes from that side. It comes from what we're seeing on the ground from our partners, and sharing that knowledge with you and hoping to learn from you as well. So I am keeping an eye on the chat to see what people are saying. Here's an incomplete list of where we are and all the places that have pledged to do open contracting, which is publishing all their contracts, the whole of them in the open. And some of them are doing really well, some of them not so much, but you'll see there's a huge diversity in where. And I think all of you can see my entire screen, right? You can't see the chat bubbles. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So you can see all the countries. Perfect. So because we only have 30 minutes, I'm gonna not cover this in much detail, but there's a lot of materials available on the Open Contracting website where you can find out more about what we do, how we're funding, and who works there. So we have a tool called the Open Contracting Data Standard, which is a map for data publishers like governments and procurement authorities. And it's based on this premise that, a procurement cycle has 5 stages. Planning, where you're planning what to procure. Tender, when it goes out to tender, there's a tender document, and people put in their bids. Award, when it is awarded to a supplier or multiple suppliers. Contract, where the legal contract is written, and there are contract conditions in it. And then implementation, which is the contract was completed, not completed, how was it completed. So these are the 5 stages of procurement, and the work that I'm going to show you today on how to find red flags are also going to be around these 5 stages. You do not need to raise your hand up to ask a question or comment, just pop it into the chat and I will have a look at it. So there are 5 stages, as I've said: planning, tender, award, contract, and implementation. A data standard tells governments what to publish in what format and when. So we're not going to go into the detail of it, but it is interesting for those of you who are in countries which are already publishing to this data standard. So I saw Colombia is publishing. There's afterwards I'll show you the countries that are publishing quite detailed data through this data standard. So if any of you are from those countries or have any trade with those countries, that would be an interesting thing for you to look at. Some examples of what the data standard says that governments should publish: things like key dates, things like supplier names, supplier IDs, addresses, contract values, milestones. When is this supposed to be published by? Where is the actual contract document? These are the kind of things we tell governments that they should be publishing and should be, represented in a data form so it can be tracked. The kind of impact that we've seen on the ground has been from, our best example is Ukraine. So after the Maidan Revolution, they went from a room full of dusty files, which is what most procurement authorities look like, to a digital setup, which was based on the OCDS, and they've saved, more than $1 billion and a reduction of the perception of corruption by business has gone down by half. So they're seeing some really interesting results. Now they've moved on to government assets as well. So, and we're going to look at an example from Ukraine around COVID as well. Example from Colombia around school meals. Again, the Secretary of State of the city of Bogota, which is huge, looked at, possibly price fixing scandal, and they found it, they busted it, and now kids are getting better quality meals, and the government saved more than $40 million. But this is what it all comes down to. Aren't government contracts confidential? Isn't it commercial information? This is what we always hear, and I'm sure you've come across this as well when you're submitting your FOIAs or you're asking for comments. So we heard this a lot as well. So we did some research and we found surprisingly little evidence to suggest that publishing more information on contracts leads to commercial threat. You can look at this research. It goes through myths, and it's quite interesting. We also produced this is just for fun. Isn't going to help you as much because you already know all of this, but it's a fun way of broaching this subject with people who you think may not understand how loopholes work. So this is a fun guide, and it's available in Spanish as well. Great. So now let's come to the part which all of you are here for, which is common like red flags and how do we find them. There's a larger guide on this, which I've linked here, which is the bit.ly/OCP journal, which covers this in much more detail. But we're going to do a shorter version today and more around COVID-19. So first thing first, red flags are so important when it comes to public procurement, because there are so many different ways, because it's a complex environment. There are lots of actors involved. Oftentimes it's chains and chains of suppliers. So it's huge supply chains. There's vested interests. So we wanted to look at it systematically and see what could be the indicators or red flags for helping government and civil society and journalists figure out, well, there's something here that I need to look further into. So think of them as your leads. These are things that will help you come up with leads for stories. So we did a research around this with the countries that are publishing in open contracting. So you can find the full research here, which is linked here, but I'm going to pull out the main things for the rest of our time together. So going back, so planning, tender, award, contract, implementation, 5 stages. So not 10, 5 stages. 5 stages, and we're going to look at the red flags for each one of them. So here's a summary table, which you can look at. It has only a few of the important ones. It doesn't have everything. But if you feel like you need a quick summary of what things you should be looking out for, here's a good table. But let's go into detail. So fraud. Things that are obvious red flags. Company has no history in providing a service or a product. So things you can look at are, who's the company? What have they been providing? This is especially important right now because so many, companies, probably for the best of intentions, most of them are moving on from cosmetics into, like hand sanitizers, moving in from, producing cars to producing ventilators, universities producing ventilators. So people most of them have good intentions, but it's important that we also scrutinize that, because it's where, since everybody is assuming goodwill, there's also a room for either mismanagement or corruption or fraud. So have a look at that. If you do know the information about supplier bids, then looking at, whether a successful supplier submitted a much lower bid than everybody else, so didn't meet the market price, that's a red flag. Or if you knew that the government was ready, if there's a range provided for what the contract is worth, but the government did have an idea for how much they want to spend, and the winning bid is very, very close to that. This is usually quite hard unless you have all of the data. Collusion. So this was really interesting and really hard to research. So we found that if the difference between the bid prices is an exact percentage, that is usually, it's too neat. So that's usually a good flag to see whether there was some collusion by the suppliers. Or if you think that there's a company, there's only a few companies that are, producing a certain item or providing a good or service, and there's no new entrants to the market, that should make you think, why is that so? Is it because they don't let any newcomers come in? Is there some sort of collusion going on? And then bid rigging. So single bidders. This is really interesting. It's probably one of my favorite parts, because I think that we know that competition in the market is a good thing. So you want to have more people, more companies, more non-profits also bid for government contracts, bidding for these, providing these products and services. But if there's only one single bidder, that instantly raises it as either the market is uncompetitive or there's something else going on. So looking at direct awards, which are happening a lot at the moment, and some of it is understandable because it's, if a government knows a supplier, has dealt with them before, if there's only one supplier that they can think of and there's an immediate need to use that, this is exactly the kind of circumstances we would expect to have more direct awards. But even then, that must be done transparently. And also you should be scrutinizing it, to saying whether really was that the best supplier to go, were there other suppliers there too? Or if there's someone who keeps winning contracts and is the only one submitting bids, that also should give you some positive thing. And there's a graph from The Economist, which is really eye-opening, around the trend of single suppliers or single bids across Europe. Here is when you think a contract has been written in such a way that only one company really fit it, or if it's issued at a very inconvenient time. So, I mean, right now, probably everything is both a convenient and inconvenient time. It's really, really hard market for suppliers. For many suppliers are really struggling. So that one's a bit less relevant. But you can look at how long companies have to respond to bids. That's a good indicator. You can also look at, whether the tender is not very well advertised. This has come up, actually. We had a call with our partners last week, and this did come up as one of the points that even though governments don't have a lot of time and they want to get these like health-related, infrastructure-related contracts out quickly, they're not being advertised well. So even though there are companies who could have submitted bids, just don't know about them. And if looking at the award and the implementation stage, you can look at conflicts of interest. This is something which is, I saw some news around Brazil. I've seen some news around US. This seems to be coming up a lot. I think I saw something in India. So there, you are already writing stories about this. This is the ball is in your court. This is the stuff that journalists are amazing at, is finding those conflict of interest. So looking at, supply networks would be really good. Or if it's a direct award, and we've discussed that already. With implementation, this is difficult in the COVID-19 scenario, because what's happening is that a lot of contracts are being let out, but you don't know on what terms. And so you can't track whether that happened or not. It's very similar to source of funds as well. We know that a lot of MDBs, multilateral banks and development banks have offered assistance, but that doesn't show up in procurement. So it's really hard to say, okay, so-and-so said they were going to give how many million to this government department. Did that show up? Did that lead to any contracts? What contract did it lead to? That bit is really hard to piece together unless you follow their press releases. But here's a warning. Just because something looks suspicious does not mean it is. And that is a very, very good thing to keep in mind. Things often look very suspicious. And it is, we just have to do more work on verifying things. And I'm going to touch on ventilators in a second, because I think that's a really good point. So now looking at COVID-19 related things that we've seen in our network. So we have about 12 minutes for this, and then we can have questions and answers on this. So emergencies, why are emergencies make everything more susceptible to corruption or fraud or mismanagement? It's really important to think about mismanagement as well, because a story came out in the UK actually on this, where the department, so I'm sharing the UK story because I'm based in the UK and I just heard it last week, that the Department of Health in the UK had told another central government department that will need more ventilators, and it just got lost in the communication. No one picked up on it. So though that's not corruption, it definitely is mismanagement, and it's a story worth telling. It's a clear public interest story. So things that make this more complex. There's an urgent need, oxygen is running out. There's no PPE. All these things are creating the environment where governments are under immense pressure, which is understandable, to procure these items. There's problems in coordination, as I just mentioned. Departments are not talking to each other. Of course, in an ideal world, every government agency would be talking to each other, would be able to have access to each other's data. There are stories of how one department doesn't know what the other department is buying, so they're buying from the same supplier, but at wildly different prices. So they're just not coordinating, or they're competing against each other, because they all need, with hand sanitizers and ventilators, this is what's happening. And even with PPE, everybody wants them, and there's not that much supply. So they are bidding against each other, which is raising the prices through the roof. There's a really interesting story from Ukraine, which I'm going to share with you after this. Very, very, very in depth of how they looked at that. Then there are newer suppliers in the market. So we're stepping in to fill that gap, which again, it could be with the best of intentions. It probably is for most of them. For a small percentage, it won't be. And that's the small percentage that we need to hold accountable and ensure that gets, caught in time. And then, the fact that governments are coordinating this really huge cross-border, like, there's trade talks happening at the same time because, suppliers are in different countries. It means that it raises the risk. And we've seen that in some instances, the usual public procurement rules for due diligence, for not doing direct awards, for transparency are being relaxed. So it's important that that doesn't happen. So civil society is doing, its best to raise that awareness, and really calling on the government to not relax those rules. But it is happening, and that's why we anticipate that a lot of those stories that are coming out are just like bubbling under the surface, and there are going to be a lot more. So, which is good, because we want, everybody needs people like you to be looking into them and telling those stories. Here's some ideas for stories based on what I've heard from our partners of like government and civil society, and what I've seen happen. Well, let's go back. So that is, you could look at public procurement in general for your country, for your city, for your state, how much is being spent, which regions is it going to, how is it impacting what's happening on the ground. You could track the purchase of certain items like respirators, ventilators, PPE, certain drugs. You can look at direct award, especially when the direct award is quite big and there was an obvious competitor that it could have gone to, or a few competitors. So you could look at that. You could look at, with just looking at direct awards, it's really, really interesting stories around ventilators, because I saw from at least 2 or 3 countries where there were stories, and this is in Europe, where I saw that there's a couple of suppliers that could provide them, but the main contract went to a supplier that has no history of providing it. And, in the UK, that would be Dyson. So they worked with a university to do this, but when it was initially reported, a lot of the suppliers who make this every day and are specialized in this were, kind of came out. So one of your allies are people who, are the producers of this, because they are just as invested in making sure that the market is fair as you. So those are great sources for information. They know the inside prices, they know, what the cost price is, and what the supply chain looks like and why it's complex. They understand that complexity. So they're really, really interesting allies. Then looking at, network analysis of top suppliers, there's a story I'm going to share with you, which was done by Ojo Publico, which is really, really interesting, looking at companies in Switzerland and different parts of the world, and looking at the public procurement of Peru, and which countries and which companies the government was talking to, and how that unfolded. Really excellent piece of journalism. And looking at the price differences for similar items. So you could look at what the price of a certain item was before the crisis, what it is now, how much it's increased, and that itself tells a really important narrative, which it's our role to talk about that. And then the last one is actually probably the most difficult one, which is looking at delivery. So many items were purchased. Were they delivered? What was the quality of them? What is, how useful are they? I have family members who are doctors, and they were telling me that a lot of the procured masks, for instance, they just break when you wear them. So, that kind of speaks a little bit to quality, and that's really hard to measure unless you're talking to the people on the ground. Similarly, about quantity, I think that's the one that we need to pay attention to as well, and which regions it's going to. So in your countries, you will know where the need is, and you will know where what the differences in the socioeconomic backgrounds or the demographics are. And that's the interesting thing to think about, is like the distribution of wealth and the power that's held by different countries. And there's a fantastic blog by my colleague Camilla, which I've linked into the slides, and I can share them in the chat afterwards as well. And she goes, for those of you who are data journalists will be really interested in it, because she goes through all the different data points that you should be looking at for doing this investigation. So here's an example of a table that she produced about the most important ones for the 5 stages. Okay, so we have 5 minutes. Let's go through these. So here's some stories from open contracting countries. So as I said, we have more than 40 countries that we work with, and of them there are quite a few that are producing a lot of data. And I've collected the stories that are, or the publishers that will be interesting for you. And if you are from any of these countries, please do write that in the chat. I'd love to see and know who's here. So an example, let's start with the first one around Paraguay. So they have got a special identifier which in data tells you that this contract is taken from the COVID-19 response fund. So that way you can see, exactly how much is being spent for COVID-19 with which suppliers, and you can track that. Great practice. Something to recommend also if you're writing stories, which is, which is telling government what they should not be doing, or what they should be doing. This is a good example to give about good practice. Ukraine, another great example they have a business intelligence tool called Bizoro, and it has a specific module which shows all the emergency procurement that's happening. And I'm going to show you a graph from the civil society organization Transparency International Ukraine that did that piece of research, which just came out. We published it yesterday. Colombia, this National Health Institute is actually doing quite a lot of direct awards, which, as I said, is kind of understandable in the circumstances, even though it's not best practice. But what they are doing it transparently, which is really important. So they are asking for quotes, they're asking for delivery times, they're publishing this. So you can see all of this. And you can see that they also disclose technical comments about why something is a certain way, why there might be, the supply chain might be, more complex, or more like there might be delays down in there, and why. So that's really, really transparent. In Chile, they have, they've published all the urgent items they need to buy, so that it helps suppliers who are usual suppliers to know that there might be demand coming for these items, but also people who are at the moment, again, they have production houses which may not be being used, and they want to use them to help the government, to help their country. They now have a list of items that they could be providing. So it's also a good example of opening up the market and making it more open and allowing citizens to do their civic duty. In Portugal, they've created, the IMPEC has created an open data set for their national open data portal, and they update that weekly. They publish all the contracts that are using their emergency fund, so they have separate legal provisions for that. Okay, let's look at the next. Oops. Okay, it took me to the Bizarre thing, which I can just really good to show. Let me it's just opening up the sheet. Here we go. So, yes. This is the research that I was telling you that Transparency International Ukraine has done. So they've looked at the prices for medical masks, and again they've looked at the details of that, and you can see that in how they've actually plotted it on a graph, and you can see the differences in prices. It's huge. Almost 50 times as high as it was in December, which is only a few months ago, even though it feels like it was ages ago. So, and they found that public entities have bought almost 2.5 million surgical masks, and how much they spent. So this is the kind of really in-depth detail they were able to do because they have access to that data. You may be from a country where you don't have access to that data, so I completely understand that. And I have an example for you as well. But for those of you who do have access to the data, it's a really good, and the blog, which the link is here, it really goes through how they did that. So you could use the same model. And then this is a really good story from Ojo Publico, which is looking at, again, Peru, and where, when Peru wanted to procure, these emergency items, where those came from and what were the negotiations that happened. Really excellent piece of journalism. Look at that. They've got lots of graphs and examples. I chose the one that's about the Swiss company, which and it talks about where they're authorized to sell their molecular tests. So it gives you an idea of the kind of network analysis they did on these big supplier companies. The link is there as well, so you can have a look at that. And what happens if you are in a country where this data is not available? Well, it is tough. I'm not gonna lie, it's gonna be tough, and you will need to use a lot more of your traditional journalism, looking at informants in the government, looking at whistleblowers, or doing FOIA requests. But there's a really good example from Mexico, which done by Poder and El Intercambio in Guatemala, which looked at what happens under natural disasters. So they looked at the data that they could find, even if it wasn't in the best format, and they were able to use it to map it to OCDS and then run some of those visualizations and analysis that exists. So that's all the time that we have for, but I'm just going to run through these slides, which you have access to. So it just talks about, what are the things you may be helpful for you if you are not a data journalist, but are, kind of getting to that level. So the tools that could be useful, the places where you can get more data, the portals, and finally, all the data sets that you can get, which use the OCDS, and which part of the world they are, what stage they're at. It's all available on our website. So if you go to the section, and I think the link is in there, but if not, I'll pop it into the chat as well. So it's on the website under About, and then you can see where it is. You can use the map view or the list view to view all the countries. So yes, this is it. I'm very looking forward to hearing your questions and seeing what you think.